Hi, everyone. Thank you for tuning into our webinar about driving value through a robust SIOP process. This webinar will be focusing on the demand planning step. First, let me introduce the team. Presenting from the TriVista team today will be Jerry Joyce, myself, and Melissa Henderson, as well as Jeffrey Porter from StockIQ. We also have a couple other TriVista team members on the call. You might hear them jump in every once in a while. TriVista is an operations and technology firm. We focus on identifying and making improvements for our clients through multiple different services such as supply chain, continuous improvement, technology, transaction advisory support, PMI, and well as many others. We also offer a leadership solutions service that helps with executive level recruitment and placing interim management roles. All the team members here on the call today are a part of our supply chain team. In our supply chain work, we can assist with issues such as excess inventory, poor lead time adherence, sourcing issues, network optimization, warehouse improvements, and logistics. I will now hand it off to Jeffrey to introduce StockIQ.
Yeah, thank you, Rachel. Appreciate that introduction. StockIQ is a supply chain planning software suite that assists our clients in managing forecast, inventory, replenishment, and capacity. Our overall focus is to help our clients put the right inventory in the right locations at the right time and support the overall SIOP process. And we're just delighted that we've been working with the TriVista organization. We like to think about people, process, and tool. StockIQ bring the tools in place. TriVista assists with process analysis and process development.
Perhaps right now would be a good time to just say a few words about how TriVista found StockIQ. Back in 2019, we were implementing a SIOP process for a NetSuite client, and we determined that they needed a bolt-on supply chain planning tool. And so we contacted softwareadvice.com, which is a company that helps match software companies with potential customers. And StockIQ was one of their recommendations. So we went through a comprehensive RFI and RFQ process, starting with 10 companies. And long story short, StockIQ was the clear winner, and we've been working as strategic partners ever since then.
Great. Thank you, Jerry and Jeff. In case you missed last webinar, I really recommend going back and watching that first. It can be found on our TriVista website. In the first webinar, we go over the whole SIOP process at a high level. We cover how a robust SIOP process can improve EBITDA and how StockIQ is integrated throughout the system and the benefits it provides. This webinar today will be solely focusing on the demand planning step of the SIOP process.
Thank you, Rachel. As she just mentioned, we're going to dive into demand planning today. Simply put, demand planning forecasts future demand by analyzing input data and then predicting future demand patterns. These inputs include historical demand with an overlay of market intelligence from sales and products.
Add a little bit about sales intel. It's really everything that would not be reflected in the historical sales data. So it's like new product introductions, one-time events, promotions, or one-off customer actions, key wins and losses, planned obsolescence, product rollovers, new business trends, anything that wouldn't be reflected in the history of, and the statistical forecast.
Sherry. With that information, it is also important to note that predicting demand can be impacted by the accuracy of your inputs and your data. So in particular, some of the information Jerry just mentioned, like customer behavior, seasonality, or sales promotions, those can increase the risk to having an accurate future-looking forecast. The success of SIOP really starts with a robust demand plan. As you may be feeling one of the business symptoms on the left-hand side, such as a manual process, lack of visibility, excess inventory. In additional slides, we'll go into more detail about how StockIQ helps to streamline this process. However, these are just a few highlights of what a good and robust process will entail. First, you heard Jeffrey mention StockIQ especially ensures that you have the right part at the right place at the right time. A comprehensive demand plan allows for a more accurate production schedule, ensures you are ordering the correct amount of material, and ensures that it arrives within the necessary time. A demand plan also gives you visibility to what is needed, thus allowing for improvements in managing your inventory. And lastly, a demand plan gives you visibility to when those materials are needed. StockIQ in particular can easily identify stockouts and projected stockouts. We then use statistical forecasting because it's objective, data-driven, and removes any bias. Automating this process by using StockIQ, for example, allows you to manage large data sets, thus reducing the man hours required, and in return improves employee efficiency and productivity. Say goodbye to your Excel calculations and that endless spinning wheel. To emphasize, statistical baseline forecasting facilitates easier decision-making and provides insight into demand patterns or behavior.
A baseline demand plan can be created no matter the maturity of your supply chain team. Very few inputs are needed to get a standard baseline demand plan. All you really need to get started is sales history, SKU bomb information, and open customer orders. StockIQ then helps to automatically analyze the data to create a comprehensive demand plan. Your team can further tailor the demand plan to your company's needs by setting SKU parameters and configurations. Not only will StockIQ create a demand plan, but it'll also make planners' lives a lot easier by alerting them of any items that need attention and producing helpful KPIs. However, the more information you put into the system, the more robust your demand plan will be. Though you only need a couple inputs to create a baseline demand plan, we really recommend adding additional inputs to strengthen your data. If the baseline inputs is all your team has right now, that's totally fine. Your team can get started and always develop and add more inputs as they become more comfortable with StockIQ.
Rachel, thank you for really highlighting that base input because it's relatively simple. ERPs contain this data, your BOMs, your sales history, historical customer orders. What we're really talking about doing when we get into a robust process is really including additional inputs that might include super sessions, anticipated customer orders, insight that's coming from outside of history that might be contained in the organization. Maybe in another entity, it might be product marketing management, it might be the marketing team, people doing promotions. So as we begin evaluating additional information, the SIOP process brings other parties together to discuss these inputs to better inform how the overall forecast looks and our anticipated demand plan moving forward.
Jeffrey, maybe we should define super session. Some people may not be familiar with the term, but it's basically a feature when a component is obsoleted and replaced with a new part. The super session feature applies the historical usage or sales data of the obsolete part as the history for the new part, so to enable more accurate sales forecasting and demand planning for that new part.
Thank you, Jerry. Yeah, very important on that, especially as we have revisions that are coming along, et cetera.
Right.
Yeah, to continue down the overall process and the outputs that get generated from this first step, what we're going to be doing is we're going to be providing in StockIQ in the software a more robust forecast by tracking the sales, events, promotions, new items that might be getting entered into the mix, current period predictions, meaning we can evaluate how sales are occurring against a plan that's in place. We also incorporate another component called forecasting hierarchies. In a SIOP process, especially if we have a lot of SKUs to plan, it's not reasonable really to begin evaluating every individual SKU and their contribution. We incorporate what we call a hierarchy, which is a roll-up of information that goes into product families that can be managed and evaluated, and they logically make sense. The other thing that we oftentimes incorporate is customer forecasting. If you're operating in an environment where you have an omni-channel approach, maybe where we're going into big box, maybe we have an electronics, maybe some brick and mortar, it allows us to separate out those different customer segmentations and provide direct input from those entities or insights where, for instance, if we have a web store, for instance, that we're selling through, if we're promoting only that web store, that information can be directly incorporated to best influence that demand plan. The outputs from this is a robust process that incorporates the inputs that will help strengthen and improve the accuracy of the overall demand plan. I'll make another note just on this as well when we talk about a demand plan. A demand plan is an organization's estimation, our best estimate of what we believe will be sold or manufactured at future dates and point. The demand plan is typically a collaboration in the best case, where we're bringing all parties to coincide on one number. This one number then drives the financial plans, the replenishment plans, and operation. But the entity is operating on this single plan, and it starts with the demand plan. So it's a very key component on how we get started in the overall process. All righty, I think what we're going to do at this point, before we start going into some real live results, is we're going to dip into the software and highlight what this actually looks like. So we'll take you through the process of looking at a forecast, one that's been created, and talk about the various inputs and how we go about doing that. So I'm going to open up a forecast window here, and we're going to take a look, and we're going to evaluate a single item that resides in a hierarchy. But before we go there, let's talk about that hierarchy. We just focused in on, in a SIOP process, how do we actually evaluate? So imagine here that I'm operating a company called Contoso, and we sell various electronics, cameras, computers, etc. You will notice in my overall hierarchy here, we've established a roll-up of these individual categories. For instance, if one of my categories is cell phones, these cell phones, I can actually generate and develop a forecast based on a roll-up of everything that fits in that overall category. You'll notice down here on the bottom that we have this category cell phones. There's individual SKUs that are represented down in here at multiple locations. Furthermore, we can take that hierarchy and we can continue to refine that if necessary. So maybe some of those phones that we're looking at are touchscreen phones, or maybe smartphones and PDAs. This might be a sub roll-up that's important when we begin thinking about planning, when we begin thinking about promoting. So this hierarchy ultimately is established based on the overall forecasts that are generated down at the individual item level, potentially down into a stocking location, potentially down into a grouping of customers. So to start with, let's talk about what an individual SKU would look like inside of that hierarchy. So we're going to focus.
Jeffrey, just one quick question for you there with hierarchies. Is this something that has to be defined in your ERP or your product lifecycle management system, or can you define that within StockIQ?
It would typically be brought in through the ERP or the PLM system that you're using, and it gets associated with an individual SKU. So a SKU gets associated with that category. Yeah, great question there, Melissa.
And Jeffrey, one thing I was going to say there too, that's so powerful, specifically so that when management is looking at it, they don't want to see the forecast at a SKU level. Management wants to understand what's happening by product category, what's happening to the business as a whole. And as you go up that hierarchy, you're able to forecast that out and understand what's coming.
Yeah, great point there. Yeah, in fact, as we're looking at this, you'll notice that I've been focusing very heavily in here on a graphical view. Oftentimes, that's kind of the view that a lot of folks like focusing on, right? Which is, hey, if I go out here and I focus in on what our operational forecast has been here, I now have a view of what our ops forecast. It's up and to the right. I'm showing forecasted growth over the next 2 years of 20%. Pretty easy number to get your arms around, right? And if we want to look at the values that are sitting down behind this, we now can go out and say, well, what does that number look like? And you have access to that value as well. Yeah, good point. I'll throw in another component in here as well, is oftentimes when we're looking at this data, different entities in the organization typically talk different units. Operations likes talking units from the standpoint that we're about generating replenishments or building the right product. We're focused in on units. Oftentimes when engaged with other entities, oftentimes that might be a revenue forecast. So we have the ability to bring that information in and say, well, what would the revenue generated from this type of a forecast look like? So now all of a sudden I'm showing this same view, not in a units basis, but in a revenue perspective. So different views. Yeah, thank you for that input. All right, let's jump over and let's take a look, and we're going to pop this back over into units. And we're going to look at what comprises and what makes up an individual forecast. So one of the things to note in here is I have selected an individual SKU. This individual SKU is residing at one of my stocking locations, and it happens to be for a specific customer grouping. So let's decompress on how we arrived at this forecast. I'm going to expand this window up in here so it's a little bit easier to see. And we're going to focus in on that sales history. We talked about, Rachel talked about one of those key elements. Sales history is that's collected when we sell a product. We have record of that within the ERP system. As an overall orientation to this chart, what we're looking at on the dotted line represents today. Everything to the left is history. Everything to the right is forward looking. But if we begin focusing in on those transactions that make up history, easily achievable and easily retrieved from the ERP, we know who's purchased the product, we know the date that it was purchased on, and the quantities that were purchased as well. So this is one of the foundational elements for creating a statistical demand plan. A couple of other things that I'll note within this data that are also quite helpful and that'll kind of lean towards what we can do to better enhance or create a more accurate forecast. One of the things to note over here in this block to the lower left is this is recording in a graphical fashion when the orders came in within this particular month and in what quantity. You will also note that in here, we're recording what our current on-hand balance was during that overall period. What this is very helpful for is understanding whether we had the right stock and the right quantity in place and whether we were able to actually fill. One of the KPIs that was mentioned in the earlier screens was measuring our overall performance. One of those performances from a SIOP perspective is what do our fill rates look like? Meaning, are we meeting the demand requirement and that demand that we had actually forecasted, and or did they exceed it? Were we able to fill? So by tracking what's on hand during any period of time, we can actually go back and amend history to say we were stocked out. Maybe that customer went to a competitor, but had we had that stock in place, what would that have actual demand look like? So through this history and through tracking on-hand balance, we can get a better predictor of what would have been sold historically. Right? So this is a starting point when establishing a statistical forecast. About three primary things that are derived when we begin forecasting. First of all, it's the overall trend, which is the demand for this product going up, going down, or staying flat? We're incorporating in StockIQ the overall trending. That's kind of the bottom line for the starting point for how we build up a forecast. The next thing that we begin incorporating is a seasonal profile. A seasonal profile is looking back over data, if we have the data, and going and saying, are there periods throughout each year that are consistently higher or lower in its consistency? So when thinking about looking at seasonality, it's ideal if there's 2 years of history in that we get to say, well, maybe April is the start of our slower periods, and we've seen that occur over the last 2 or 3 years. The way that StockIQ detects seasonality comes in a number of different ways. One, if we have that 2 years of history, we can look year over year. And we have indeed identified on this particular SKU that there's a high correlation, meaning year over year, we consistently see uptrends in sales and that period that are down. What this chart is a reflection of is showing the relative demand during that period year over year relative to where the average demand is. So for instance, out in here on this particular SKU in period number 3, we see a seasonal increase of sales of about 140% over our average. Likewise, as we begin moving into periods 6 and 7, we see a slower period of demand. Demand is sitting at about 80% of what it actually would be. Now, as we're looking at this seasonality, in the absence of 2 or 3 years of history, let's get back to that minimal data set that we need. We can actually leverage in on other things from a seasonal perspective. We can leverage in on that hierarchy that I highlighted. And if indeed that product grouping that we looked at has seasonal profile, we can actually utilize that to incorporate that seasonality into a new SKU or one that's not exhibiting it. Maybe we don't have the number of years of history that we need. We can also define a custom hierarchy in here, a custom seasonality profile, which is essentially defining where the seasonality is going to be relative to the overall average demand. Now, from that seasonality perspective, this is really instrumental in helping us inform what the statistical forecast is going to look like moving forward.
Hey, Jeffrey, I just like to emphasize how important it is for a system to recognize and account for seasonality and trends, because you don't want predictable variation to influence your standard deviation calculations for inventory and safety stock planning. So because you don't need inventory to cover predictable variation. So this is really important functionality.
Great. Thank you, Jerry.
And Jeffrey, one other thing I was going to say there is it's always interesting, you know, if your business manufactures lawn and garden equipment, you know the seasonality that you're going to see. But it's always interesting to see where businesses didn't have that visibility to their seasonality and they start understanding it as they're tracking it. So just wanted to point that out. You know, most businesses, even if it's not obvious, there probably is some seasonality in there.
Yeah, great point there. Great points. In fact, looking at this data set, a little hard to discern, right? Or even harder to discern if we're evaluating this from a numerical perspective. Obviously, we can go out and we can look at this and see what's gone on. But if we begin looking at actual sales and looking at what happened last year, it's like looking at a grid of numbers, a little bit more difficult to discern that seasonal period. Yeah, very good points there, gentlemen. Thank you. Alrighty, so let's talk about what we're going to do with that seasonal profile now that we've identified that there is indeed a seasonal profile associated with this grouping. We're going to evaluate that history. We're going to incorporate that seasonal profile, and we're going to incorporate it in the form of what we call a statistical forecast that's been laid out over the trend and includes seasonality. So you can see those peaks in demand. You can also see when the demand is going lower. This is the tool's best estimation from a statistical perspective on where the demand would be moving out into the future. So we've generated a 2-year forecast. By the way, most of our clients that are doing SIOP are generating 18 months, 24 months of forward-looking forecast moving forward. So this is our starting point. The third element that we like utilizing and that we can utilize from this forecast process is we can assess our overall forecast error associated, meaning every forecast is going to have some randomness associated with it. And one of the things that we're doing when evaluating this data and this forecast algorithm is we're going to go back in history and we're going to evaluate the difference between what actually happened and what that algorithm is highlighting. So one of the information pieces that we're pulling from this will help inform the inventory plan, which we're going to be talking about in another webinar. But this information can help inform us when we begin looking at a particular SKU. And let me share with you what I'm talking about there. So when I come back over to this individual SKU, you will note on this chart that there's a band out in here in pink that's highlighted above and below the overall forecast that we've established. This right in here is what we call a confidence band, in that we're 95% confident that the demand will fall between those the bottom and the top line of that overall pink range. Understanding that's really instrumental for helping us better inform the accuracy of the forecast. Plus, when we begin identifying the inventory required to support a specific service objective, that'll help us inform that. Alrighty, well, let's continue down through here and let's talk about some of these other inputs that can help influence what a forecast looks like. We talked about bringing in other parties. Maybe it's marketing, maybe it's product marketing management. But one of the things to note here on these charts is we've incorporated what we call events. Events can explain away historical peaks in demand that may be one time occurring. If we look at this chart over in here, you will notice a big blue bar in that we've excluded 54 units of demand from this peak demand period in here, which is a little bit abnormal. So we've been able to go out and say, okay, we understand there was a one-time sale, maybe there was a special fill or something else. We don't expect that to occur again in the future. The events help us curate the history and remove that from the history and explain away certain events that are not going to occur again, and they're documented here on the system. When the algorithms begin looking at this data, they look at what was sold and they remove those exceptions. The same thing happens with a forward-looking event, which might be a promotion. One of the things that we like collaborating within the organization is bringing folks together to say, what are we doing to influence demand? Maybe a drop in price or some other factor. So here we have a pre-blizzard sale is going to be occurring. We've estimated in this time period out in here about a 20% lift in overall demand. Now, depending on the volumes that we're going through, that may be pretty significant in how we're overall planning. So this has been incorporated incorporated directly into that future. You will notice that the demand for that period is spiked up as well. So this is a way of collaborating, including information in on this particular SKU. One of the things that I also like to note on there is you will note that there's another event that's entered out in here. Now, this event wasn't entered on this particular SKU, but it was inherited. You'll see that there's a parent up there that this belonged to. If we go back over into this forecast hierarchy, one of the powerful components about a demand planning tool and being able to create a hierarchy is we have the ability to incorporate that high-level information that's coming from our teams to say, we're going to begin promoting this product family, maybe a subcategory in that product family, and we think these various promotions are going to increase demand in X level. Just note that there's quite a number of SKUs that belong in this hierarchy that I've highlighted. So what I'm referring to in here that ties back into that other event is we can input an event at this level and basically say this is a promo, and we can pick the date that that promotion is going to be occurring. Maybe we'll put it out in the April timeframe, March timeframe, and we can define what we think that demand lift will be. We're going to incorporate a 25% lift, and we're going to say, okay, so any SKU that belongs in that hierarchy now will receive a portion of that lift proportionally based on their overall volume. So from a planning and collaboration perspective, oftentimes when we're talking about influencing the demand plan, it occurs someplace in that hierarchy. Now, this value might have come in units, but more than likely it's come in the form of like a revenue target, meaning we're expecting revenue to go up about 25% based on this overall promotion. So when entered in at this level, when we get down to the individual SKU level, we can see that portion that will be influenced by that higher level. So bottom line, when we begin looking at forecasting, incorporating this external information in can be very informative. All right. One of the things that I'd like to incorporate in here is the concept of an ABC class and an XYZ. When we look at this individual SKU, one of the things that we want to determine is it forecastable to begin with? Not all SKUs are forecastable, and we want to acknowledge that. As much as we'd like to think that our algorithms can pick everything out in here, there are certain SKUs that just aren't conducive to generating a forecast from. So there's this concept of going out and ranking all of your products based on their importance to you in the form of what we call an ABC class. And then there's another component associated with that, which is coming out in the form of what kind of behavior. Is this a recurring item that we're selling consistently? Is it sporadic, meaning we sell it and we might sell in quite a bit of quantities, but forecasting that is pretty sporadic, meaning we might get an order in 1 month and it might be 4 months before we get another order in. And then lastly, it might fall into this concept of what we call slow demand, which is maybe it's on its way out, or maybe there just wasn't much demand to begin with. So one of the things that we're looking at in this concept is the overall behavior of an item. And we tend to think of those in what we call the stratification, which is how many of our SKUs make up our top priorities, meaning are there 50 SKUs, are there 100 SKUs? And if we were to look at this ABC summary, you can see that we've identified 214 that make the A category. The B category are 227 and D's are 455. The other dimension on this is what we call the XYZ, and this is when we begin looking at the behavior of an item. Is it a new item that's been recently introduced? Is it recurring demand? Is it sporadic, or is it slow? That will help inform us on how best to plan to it in the overall order policies that we're putting in place. So one of the things that the history can help inform us on is where these get ranked in that mix and what their overall behavior is.
And Jeffrey, I was just going to point out there with the ABC classification, you can configure it so that you're looking at it. You can prioritize for your business. If you want A's to be made up of your revenue, you can do that. If you want to make it a mix of revenue, hits, units sold, you can do that. So there's configuration so that you can make that ABC classification what it needs to be for your business.
Yeah, and one other thing about the XYZ, an example that a lot of our clients have of like a Z part, if you're a distributor, you may have a big customer that says, I might only buy this once every other year, but if you don't carry it, I don't want to do business with you. So that's a lot of times what make up the Z parts, that you're forced to carry a very low demand item for, required by a customer.
Yeah, excellent point.
And that's where these stratifications become the cornerstone of developing your inventory and supply plans.
Excellent points. Yeah. And understanding and then periodically recalculating. Zach, you brought up the fact that this classing is defined, by the client. So let's actually take a look at what classing would look like. The first thing when we begin thinking about classing is to say, how frequently do we go through and do a classification? Is it monthly? Is it quarterly? You obviously don't want to be doing this every day from the standpoint that small changes in sales might shift where a product gets moved, but monthly or quarterly is pretty reasonable. I think the other thing to begin thinking about is when we're doing classing on our products is how do we look at them? Do we treat a product category distinct and on its own and not mix in other products because they might have different volumes, they might have different sales quantities. So the ability to actually go through and do an ABC stratification based on potentially that hierarchy that we have established and or the stocking location. Stocking location is really important in a lot of cases. If we have, for instance, we're a hardware distributor or manufacturer, we have facilities in the Northeast versus the Southwest. Obviously, we're going to have very different behaviors on those particular items. I'll come back over here as well, and that we talked about those various settings that we have the ability to influence in here. And it's deciding it doesn't want to come up for me. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at this stratification detail over here, and we'll look at some of those values. So as we begin looking at these overall values, let's focus in on one of those Z-based items, which is a little bit slow, or maybe we'll focus in on a Y-based item, and we'll take a look at our A-based classification. Well, we'll go out here and take a look at a B-based. So in here, we have a little bit of sporadic demand. You can see that we really can't predict those in that they're high peaks here and there, a little bit difficult, right? So how do I determine where those sales are going to be? But I think to your point, understanding how many customers are buying this, so sporadic or not, maybe it's not our ideal candidate for carrying it. But if we have one of our key customers that's purchasing that, we better make sure that that's in stock. Yeah, thank you for that insight in there. All righty. So as we continue on down here, let's continue through the process and finalize the overall demand planning. And let's talk about that collaboration and how we incorporate that. To date, we've talked about using history. We've talked about using some insight from events to help inform what this looks like. Lastly, it's what's our overall consensus. The overall consensus is what we're planning on purchasing to. It's our best estimate of what will be purchased in the future from us as an organization. This is reflected in what we call the consensus or the operational forecast. This is what we're planning on buying to. This is what we're planning on manufacturing to. This is bottom line what we're all agreeing to. This information can also be modified as well through graphical. So maybe we've all come forward here and we're looking at our overall plan and decide, you know what, we think that we can influence this demand and put a lift. So I'm going above and beyond what the statistical forecast has told me and put a lift in over this specific period. But we've used the baseline from that statistical forecast to help inform us on what we want to replenish to. So a lot of things that we can do with that statistical forecast that's been put in place. One last thing here, and then we'll move on. Once this information gets modified, it gets changed, we capture information in the form of what we call a snapshot, which is to say every time this gets changed or modified, that gets captured and put into history when we can go back and evaluate how effective some of these changes were. So as we're talking about a continuous process and continuous improvement, we can go back and evaluate, say, hey, those changes that we made and incorporated either assisted or they made the forecast worse, which is going to help better inform the organization on where we put our efforts to influencing what that demand plan looks like. Any other things you wanted me to highlight in here? Because I'd be happy to address any other questions or things that I might have missed before we move back in to the overall presentation and talk about what one of our common clients has experienced here with putting in a formal demand planning process.
Jeffrey, I just wanted to say, really appreciate the quick demo, understanding and really seeing StockIQ and its demand planning capabilities. Just wanted to take a moment because I know we saw a lot there and tell the audience, for those of you that are still working out of Excel models, don't worry, you're definitely not alone. That's where TriVista can really help analyze your SIOP maturity, your business's readiness for a supply chain planning software. We're often helping our clients find, identify, and address the gaps in terms of getting to the point where they can begin on their SIOP journey. So just know you have to start somewhere with developing a robust SIOP. That's where we come in and really help with the process.
Yeah, and just to add to Zach's point is TriVista, we understand the client's business because we're usually working with them very closely. So, StockIQ is, implements the system, but we can really help fine tune and configure the system to get the maximum value of all the features out of StockIQ's capability to match the company's, business processes.
Yeah, very informative. And the folks I'll just say from a StockIQ perspective, the folks here on the phone know the settings and they know what needs to be accomplished to best meet the overall client's needs. So we had initially talked about that partnership. This is really where TriVista's close engagement with their clients, knowing what the software does, can really enhance the output directly from that, enhance the overall experience, speeds up the implementations as well. Jerry, just to come to note that first opportunity engagement that we first worked on, we'll note that we completed an implementation in the span of 3 weeks and had results coming. And it wouldn't have occurred had we not had the assistance of Jerry and his team working with this common client to really influence how we're going to configure. It would have taken us longer to get that implemented and fine-tuned for them.
Jeffrey, before you navigate away from StockIQ, how do you measure, as a company, StockIQ and that service, how do you measure whether your platform's effective or being utilized by your clients?
Yes, well, so there's a couple different things that we can do in there, Melissa, is we maintain overall performance. So oftentimes when we begin looking at how things are performing, we want to see, are we seeing an improvement in, is inventory going down? You can see some clear trends here where it looks like the inventory is going down. It might be, are we experiencing better turns? Are we experiencing better fill rate? So it's typically through measurement of the outcomes that we're influencing, which would be, what's our fill rate? What's our service level in those aspects of it? And we do have various KPIs that are built directly into StockIQ for that. And one of the things that we're doing consistently with our clients is actually monitoring how they're doing and highlighting opportunities for improvement, if indeed maybe we hadn't fully adopted the application. In fact, one of the things that we're always doing is saying, if you're constantly looking at values and changing or modifying them, we need to stop that process and move upstream and evaluate whether or not the settings are all appropriate, whether we're getting the right data in, because that's an indication to us if you're questioning the results from the PO suggestions. Bottom line is you shouldn't have to do a whole lot aside from maintaining the parameters on a monthly view, go in and review the alerts, begin looking at your planner's dashboard out here on the front end to say, where am I going to be stocked out in the future? Where am I projected to stock out? And then monitoring that performance of the forecast. Are we under forecasting? Are we over forecasting? And do the correct amendment to that forecast so that that demand plan is accurate. We know that the replenishment comes from that because we know our lead times. We know the variation around that. Yeah. Thank you, Melissa.
All right, thank you, Jeffrey and team. I think having the demo is extremely beneficial to be able to see the different screens, so appreciate you walking us through that. What we have here is an example of a SIOP diagnostic we did for a previous client. The items highlighted in light blue are the ones relating to demand planning. It might be a little hard to see, but in that spider graph, the green line is the client and the red is our benchmark. And the demand planning section for the client is a little bit below our benchmark average. They weren't using a statistical baseline forecast and they weren't using more than a year of historical data. We did a StockIQ implementation with this client and helped them create a more robust demand planning system. It was a very successful implementation, and we're very happy to say the client is still very active in using StockIQ. So thank you, everyone. Hopefully you made it this far in the webinar. If you have any questions, you can let us know. There's a downloadable version of this, and our contact information is in our bios. Otherwise, you can reach out to the StockIQ website or the TriVista website for any information or contact us.
Yes, thank you, everybody. We certainly appreciate your time today and happy to address additional questions. I think it was noted that we went through a lot of information pretty quickly. Obviously, happy to assist you in evaluating whether the services of TriVista to help your organization improve, implement a SIOP process, and whether or not a tool like StockIQ that helps with demand, supply, and inventory would be appropriate for your organization. So with that being said, thank you so very much. Feel free to reach out to each organization. We'd be happy to address those questions individually.
Yep.
Thanks,
Thank
all.
you.
Yeah, thank you, everyone.